All right.
Okay, so good evening or good late afternoon to everyone. So this is continued discussions by the Short-Term Rental Committee. First on the agenda for this evening, I've just passed out a copy of minutes from the last meeting, so if everyone could take a look at those and just give me your thoughts on those. Try to keep it short and sweet. Okay. Everyone good with the minutes? All right.
Do we have to move to accept or?
We really haven't
not
been.
formal.
Yeah, we're not that. It was an ad hoc where we're not that
Which is
formal.
fine.
Yep. Okay, so just kind of a quick overview and reminder. So at the last meeting, we looked over a document that was the draft short-term rental committee findings presentation, and I apologize, I meant to have it on the screen tonight, but I'll say technical difficulties make that not possible tonight. So we'll have our paper copies. So there were a number of questions and comments about some of the slides, and so I made some modifications to those based on feedback from folks. And then I also got the sense that the committee also just generally wanted to have a little bit more time to look over what was on the presentation. So with that being said, I want to go through and just discuss primarily what the changes were to the presentation. So the first two pages remain the same. So that was the what has the committee been doing, the sort of new economy slide. Yes.
One quick question. The second page, stats for Maine, not just on Airbnb. There was a Portland Press Herald article that
Yes.
gave you the 2018 stats
It
for
didn't,
Airbnb.
and I can use those stats. They weren't as comprehensive
Okay.
as what was on the 2017.
Okay,
Uh,
thank you.
Yeah, so that's the only reason why I kept these, is that it didn't have a direct comparison with the,
Okay.
with the 2017 ones. So the next page, the question was how much housing stock is used in some way for short-term rentals. So as you recall before, we had a slide there that did a comparison between Kennebunkport and the city of Portland.
I printed it just regular.
And so I removed the city of Portland. Folks didn't think that was a good comparison, so we pulled that out. And I also, there was a question about whether or not the rental stats, the short-term rental stats that were used, as to whether or not those were just single-family homes or residential rentals. So I went back through the inventory list and checked what was in there. And so you see a different number there. Instead of, what did we have, 265? So that number dropped to 248. And the primary difference there was Resort at Goose Rocks, was removed, since Resort at Goose Rocks is, from an ordinance perspective, considered a hotel. That's just in a condominium form of ownership. But other than that, all the 248 that are listed here were residential homes. So there was also some interest, a little bit more interest in the mailing list that we sent out, or whenever we sent the survey out, wanting to know, generally speaking, the demographics. So that's the next slide. And so what we're showing there is that, owners of, short-term rentals, so we used the list, that 248, and that showed us, where owners of short-term rentals generally live. No surprise, 71%, reside in New England, I just broke it down, New England and other, because otherwise I would just, we'd have a slide here with a lot of little slivers for all 50 states. And I didn't think that was helpful. And then further that, the local, kind of the local breakdown. We showed you just, the local ownership. 15% of the short-term rental listings, were owned by property owners living and residing in Kennebunkport. And then you have a Kennebunk and Cape Porpoise breakdown.
So that's a total of 51?
Correct. Yep, that have as ownership, or I should say the mailing addresses were local.
That,
Mailing
and this is
addresses.
based upon the responses?
No, this was based on that
248.
that 248. So when we did our own in-house research of identifying of properties that were short-term rentals that showed up on, an Airbnb, VRBO, and other sites. So out of that 248, this is that breakdown. And then moving on, so we had the survey results page, which didn't change. Then there was a question of wanting to know where the surveys were mailed to. And again, pretty consistent, majority of them, went to addresses in New England. And the surveys, so this isn't the short-term rentals themselves, this is the actual survey that got
That
mailed
got
out
mailed.
to residents. And so those were mailed out to, and again, the majority in Kennebunkport, and then, you have your other breakdowns for property ownership in Kennebunk, Cape Porpoise, and some West Kennebunk ones. And then the next couple of slides they didn't change any. These were the questions. So we'll just go through that. Question 1 didn't change. Question 2 didn't change. Question 3 did not change. 4 didn't change. 5 did not change. 6 did not change. 7 did not change. And 8 and 9 did not change. The survey says slide, that also did not change. The public participation, things that we heard, that content also stayed the same. Short-term rental committee, again, pulling some of your all's individual thoughts, that also did not change. As well as staff observation slide, that did not change. So the next slide, next two slides were the additional questions, and this was a formatting request. So what I did is I broke down the the perceived issue, and then adjacent, just directly next to that is what we found. So it should be a little bit easier to understand. So perceived issue, full-time residences are being converted to short-term rentals. What we found is that without the registry of short-term rentals to compare, that is difficult to verify. Properties are being sold to be specifically used. Again, what we found is that without some kind of a registry, it's difficult to predict intent of buyer. And that real estate prices, the increase in real estate is likely due to the desirability of the port in general. And then the next slide, also additional questions, is the same format. Perceived issue, noise and trash have increased due to visitors who stay at short-term rentals. Again, our current data collection tools don't allow us to really specifically pinpoint that at short-term rental users versus full-time residents. And then Kennebunkport Kennebunkport has less residents and more empty homes than that are short-term rentals. And that it isn't necessarily direct data, but we do know that non-resident ownership is increasing dramatically over resident ownership. And that just addresses the data on the next slide, which
That's only new housing. That's what I was talking about last time. I think that's a false assumption to make, that we know that non-resident ownership is increasing. We know that non-resident ownership of new housing is increasing.
No, what this, and maybe the title could be clarified. You know, but this is the annual increase in new housing units. You know, so, and I mean, by default, that's new construction.
Right.
Okay? But because it's pulling from two different data sources, so you have new local mailing addresses.
Yeah.
And so that's looking at the database as a whole. Okay?
Okay.
So regardless of whether or not you added housing stock in, you know, this is just looking at how many new local mailing addresses have we added to the database over the course of the year, or over the course of each one of these years. And we're able to do that because we have static databases from each one of those years. So we're able to look at it, and compare from year to year.
But do we know how many non-resident people owned houses before that? I mean, is that part of that? I mean, wouldn't that be part of that?
Well, I mean, you would just subtract that out.
But that's for new, I'm talking about existing housing stock.
Right.
My point is,
So if you took away the new housing unit data,
yep,
okay, and just merely looked at new local mailing addresses, okay? So what this would tell you is that in 2014, we added 9 new local mailing addresses to town. And when I say local mailing addresses, that is folks who, you know, gave a local mailing address as their preferred point of contact. 2015, we didn't add any. 2016, we added 5, 17, we added 13, 18, we added 2.
right. But my point is that was only dealing with new houses.
No, that is overall. That is-
I understand that,
that
but I
is-
mean, that doesn't take into account that the fact that a lot of homes are already owned by out-of-staters.
True, absolutely, right. Yeah,
That's
Yeah,
like the most
absolutely.
important point of that, I think.
But
Right.
they
But-
would be, yeah, it'd still be a new address if they
Yeah.
moved.
Yeah, this isn't.
This is showing the change.
This is not showing, this is not saying that of the 23, 9 were a local mailing
Correct.
address, or.
Correct. I understand that,
Yeah.
but I'm just saying that, to me, the statement that we know non-resident ownership of residential property is increasing dramatically over resident ownership.
Yeah,
Do we really know that?
well, because the number of local mailing
So
addresses.
okay, so you're
And
just,
I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think what he's saying is, previously, how many local mailing addresses did we have?
Right.
As opposed to.
well, that's right, the comparison,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
that's what I meant.
And I guess
the only way to look at that is you'd have to go back to the tax
Point,
files.
yeah, and the point is that we only have, for
The
static
data, gotcha.
databases, we only have
It only goes back
Right.
that
to
far.
2014.
Yep.
Yeah, so we haven't, because that's, realistically, that's what you have to have, you know, you have to have a static point. to
At
do a-
some point,
To do a comparison of, yeah. If I'd have had more, I would have added more, you know, in through there.
Does this
Right.
include post office boxes? Like, if I had a post office box at.
Would.
Yes,
Kennebunk-
yeah.
or Kennebunkport.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because it can't, I can't make the assumption that just because there's a PO box versus a physical street address.
That they don't live in town.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
when you say new housing units, is that just built properties, or is this changing over? Is this properties? that
No, this
somebody
isn't,
buys?
this isn't a changeover, this is new construction.
New
You know, so we
construction.
added,
Okay,
this number of housing units
Okay.
in each one of these years.
Can I ask a question? A lot of the new housing units are pretty high-end properties.
Correct.
Renting them out.
But, but the other part is, looking at those statistics, a lot of the building that's gone on the last 4 or 5 years is high-end properties that most people that live in town can't afford, that people buy for a summer home that have more money that live elsewhere.
Correct.
Summer home.
Yep.
So, it kind of skews that comment a little bit too, as far as what you're saying about people aren't having an address that's in town, but a lot of those houses could be empty all winter.
That's true, yeah, and I think I would, I mean, generally speaking, I would say that's the case, that the majority of, what we've seen for new housing stock is are primarily second homes. And to some degree, that's kind of what this data is saying, because if they were properties that were lived in by residents, we'd see a much higher number in the increase of a local mailing address. So if they were all folks who were living here year-round, then you'd see that local mailing address number would be higher than the housing unit number.
So Kennebunkport, in that respect, is catering to people that live out of state.
No, I wouldn't say that it's catering. I think it's
So
it's a
demographically,
it-
people
it's
that
just-
live in town can't afford it, so.
it's a function of what's occurring.
Right.
Whether the town caters towards it or not is, that this data doesn't really talk to that piece. It's just showing that we have X number of new housing units in each one of these years. Compare that to the number of new local mailing addresses, and it's dramatically different.
So how does that relate to short-term rentals? All that-
Well, it's the only data point that we have to this question, that says that Kennebunkport has less residents and more empty second homes, that are short-term rentals. So we don't necessarily know that they're short-term rentals, but we do know that non-resident ownership is increasing dramatically. That's all that is pointing out.
And,
That's because if you look at the perceived issue is that we have less residents and more empty second homes that are short-term rentals, and what we found is that we just know that, in terms of on a factual basis, that non-resident ownership is increasing.
So I guess maybe on the perceived issue, we make the assumption maybe that these empty second homes are being used for short-term rentals, but perhaps the point you're making is that they're empty second homes, but they may not
It
be,
may be seasonal, that they
Yeah.
come up and spend
True.
June and July and August
Right.
here with their
right.
extended families, not necessarily short-term rentals.
Well, I've mentioned it last time, that certainly the trend at Goose Rocks, that when a house gets sold, it's many times taken out of the rental stock. It's not rented anymore. It becomes a home, that the people that are buying the houses don't need to rent them.
Exactly. Or the houses are being built or renovated or.
Yeah, most of them do get, most
Right.
of them get
Right,
totally renovated.
right, yeah.
And what Kennebunk is building is higher-end houses. If we had affordable housing in town, those statistics would be different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah,
yeah, I
possibly.
mean, possibly, right. I
Affordable
mean,
housing has been an issue in town.
Right.
I think I started on the growth planning committee back in the late eighties, and it was one of our major issues. And that's when we introduced the growth planning committee, and the town added the mobile home portion, which we have now eliminated or
No.
modified, right? Modified, no? We didn't change it at all?
It's still there.
It's still there?
Yeah,
But
the
only
park
way-
standard is still there.
It was the cost of land, so the way to get around affordable housing was to, in a mobile home park, you have, one owner of land and you lease your lot and you're able to afford a home that way. That was the only way we could satisfy the state's requirement for affordable housing component in our comprehensive plan. We had to have something addressing affordable housing, and it was tough, because at that time, I think the average lot was around $100,000 or close to it, so, I
That's in
mean,
the eighties?
yeah, late eighties, yeah. Well, there was a boom in the late eighties
Yeah.
too. But still, that was, we struggled with that for a long time.
And I mean, what it also shows is Kennebunkport's been really successful as far as bringing people here and being this being a destination for tourists or higher end homeowners. So a lot of it's helped us. So,
I meant to mention last time too, that when you look at other states and communities and stuff, they actually a lot of the communities call short-term rentals vacation rentals. That's how they term it.
Mhm.
They don't
Yeah.
call them short-term
Right.
rentals, they call them vacation rentals. But it's the same thing, people buy houses to rent and stuff like that, so.
I guess what we really want to do is look at what the impact on the community is of this. I mean, the statistics are important to know, but I think how people feel about it and, the effect on the school system and community feel, I think that's the real issue. that
And the
needs to
problem
be
is with our
addressed.
survey, a vast majority of the people that responded were non-residents. When you look at
Yeah.
it, zone by zone.
That's
a
right.
Vast
Yeah,
majority.
yeah, and I think, I mean, we certainly saw, a significant response of folks from Goose Rocks, I think that,
Well, when you have,
I
I
mean,
think
that's-
I guessed at the numbers of properties at Goose Rocks at around 400 and in the Goose Rock zone, and 200, basically more than 60% of the people at Goose Rocks Beach responded to the survey, which is amazing,
yeah,
yeah.
so.
yeah,
And like you
That's-
said, a lot of them are people that own homes that aren't short-term renting them, they're there for the summer.
They're there for the
and keep
summer.
them empty 'cause
Yeah.
they can afford that.
But we heard, I don't know if Bruce, I don't know if you guys were at any of the early meetings, we've heard dramatically from other people that don't live in town and do own houses that do rent them short-term as a way to afford a home here.
Right, yes.
So that was the strategy, so.
yeah. I think, we certainly learned that it's a lot more complicated than, than, than you initially may think. And, and I think what I think is clear to me is that, especially with the survey results where, it was pretty clear to me that, that folks at this point, generally speaking, didn't want to see any kind of regs on short-term rentals. But what I do think is important is that, and this is, the recommendations didn't really change here, but that, this is something that is always going to affect Kennebunkport. And so I think it's important to start some level of trend monitoring in order to be able to make future decisions on this.
And I think when you had up the PowerPoint last time, there may have been more slides than we have here printed out, only because we did have some breakdown by area of town.
Yes.
And-
So, right, so this is just the presentation for, for the selectmen. But what's on the website and what, and what we certainly looked at the last time is that we broke out the responses based on the areas, where folks identified that they were from. And so, and there was a difference between, Goose Rock's respondents clearly felt one way, and folks who identified themselves in the village, felt somewhat differently, about it.
And rural.
And rural as well. So, definitely, we found that there were varying opinions throughout town based on where you lived. So,
As to whether we should regulate or not.
that's correct.
Correct.
Yes.
So, if, regulations is putting limitations on things and like having standards and all of that, is a registry considered, if you registered properties that were being used, is that considered a regulation?
Well, I think some would. I think folks would consider that a reg, by requiring some type of, I guess that's the question, is that, if you're going to have a registry, you have to make some level of requirement, and then to me, the ultimate, the practical question is, well, what happens if they don't?
Right,
You know,
exactly.
you just, you kind of keep going on down the trail of asking
Why
those.
have a regulation if you can't enforce it?
Right, yeah,
Basically.
yeah, and if you don't have some level of enforcement to it, then,
Why have the regulation?
right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So,
But if you want, like, people were asking for data, do we have data on noise complaints or behavior complaints or whatever the issue was,
yeah,
on whether it was a short-term rental or not? We didn't have that data because we didn't know whether properties were being used as short-term rentals.
right.
So the registry, as far as just saying
Well,
that
didn't-
you have your property and you
So-
rent it.
So one of the items that, that the town can do, and these are, so we go into the last slide here is, things to consider of the two items. I said trend monitoring of short-term rentals and departmental review of current nuisance ordinances. And so one possibility is to, there's online resources that allow you to get that information, So, last time we had, we just had staff spend,
Right.
a week
Many hours.
perusing, all the websites to come up with, the list, of properties. Now, that's one way, that's one way to do it. We can do that, if the town is, if staff is directed to do that on an annual basis, to keep gathering some data. That would tell us to some degree whether or not that number is increasing or decreasing.
And then would the town keep a list of properties that are known to be short-term rentals? Or not?
Well, we have that list from what we did,
You do?
last year, it's just it's an Excel spreadsheet that we have.
Right,
And if staff is directed to do that again, then we can do that again. Or, like I said, there's other resources out there to where you can do some online trend monitoring through different third parties, that'll give you an annual report. So, so that's another option as opposed to having staff do that. So that's one piece. I mean, it'll give you a list of, then this, I think the second piece of it is there a better way that we can tie, calls and complaints, more specifically to that list? Okay,
because that would get
that would get the
the public
other,
the data that
that
they
would
were
get the
asking
other
for.
data, regarding nuisance issues, so are we getting a ton of, out of whatever, 100, noise complaints that we got over the course of the year, how many of them are going to properties that are, identified as short-term rentals, and how many of them just go to properties that aren't short-term
Right.
rentals,
So
so.
going forward, if you're thinking like we're starting to look at all of this now, then going forward, that information would be helpful to have.
Right, exactly, yep. And because I think, some of the questions that we're left with on one of the other slides is, first of all, are short-term rentals increasing in town? And, the question that comes to mind for me is, how many, if they are, is the question, how many is too many? And what is that number? I don't know what that number is. I mean, there's nothing out there that will tell you that
And if
this
we
is
put one
the,
out there, it's gonna be a problem.
this is the appropriate percentage of housing stock that, in order to maintain X and Y, that just isn't out there, because it's a matter of opinion.
Regarding a registration, it seems like there are a lot of communities where they do have registration of short-term rentals, sorry. And I don't know how they go about doing it when you talk about, enforcing it. Do you know what they do?
Well, I mean, again, it goes back to starting some legislation. I mean, you'd have to create a requirement. If you're going to require people to come in and register, then the governing board, either through a policy or an ordinance, would, that would have to be enacted in order to create a registry where people come forward. Now, staff going out to the internet and looking at public record, what's out on the internet is not really a,
I don't
you
even
know.
know if on some of these websites, whether they actually have the physical address of the property out there. They'll say Kennebunkport, sometimes it's
Yeah.
actually in Lower Village, or,
Sometimes it's in a Gunport, I've noticed.
Yeah. right.
Or it's York, or it's, you put Kennebunkport and you go down a little bit, and all of a sudden it's all the other
Right.
Yes.
towns
Yeah.
that just pop up.
Most of the services have enough filters in them that they, that they locate those that are within the geographic boundaries of the town, and I've looked at a couple different ones. Some are better than others. Some that are, I would say that are on the less sophisticated side, picked up a lot of stuff from Arundel, just because it was going up, based off a zip code. I mean, I will say that, the ones that, when we did a comparison between one of the kind of online demos versus what staff did, we were pretty close in terms of the numbers. I mean, we were only about 20 off, which I think for that grand scheme of numbers wasn't bad, in terms of, being off on the numbers. So, I mean, we have we have local knowledge, and so a lot of times, when you see the picture that pops up, you say, oh yeah,
That's-
I know that house.
Smith House, yeah.
I mean, it's not that big a town, so. And so I think that was the one benefit that, that staff had, is that,
They knew,
that's right.
All the
We
homes.
could, we probably, were able fairly quickly to identify 80% of them, and between the rest of us in the office, we looked at the pictures and figured out what the rest of them, so.
yeah.
So
You know,
I sometimes
but-
I think that we tend to focus a lot on, like, whether there have been noise complaints or this sort of thing. But I think that we also have to consider, again, the community feel, the character of Kennebunkport, and what the residents want that to be. And how will a large number of short-term rentals and maybe party houses, how will that affect the character of our community? So sometimes people aren't going to call in to the police for problems when they sense a problem, or if there are a lot of short-term rentals, say, on their private road, and, it's not like there's a nuisance, it's more that it's no longer a community in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these are some things that I think that are relevant, but are difficult to measure.
One of the points I made initially was that if you have a residential area, how can somebody then rent out their house and make money? You're actually conducting business. Well, if you're in a residential area, should you be allowed to do that? That was my thing. But then again, if you own your property, there's an ownership thing here. And what should you be told you can and cannot do? There's a fine line there.
From a character perspective, I've heard the same thing, just with the increase in seasonal homes. Regardless of who's actually staying there, the fact that, and I think, we're seeing this just overall in town, is that there's, more and more ownership of property that is occurring by folks who don't live here, regardless of whether it shows up on a short-term rental or not. And so, I think the wintertime population just, I'll use the wintertime pop, continues to decrease, and the summertime population continues to, is when it bumps up, so.
So I guess I have to disagree with that community feel a little bit, because I think Kennebunk's done a lot to disrupt that community feel for a long time. I mean, they wanted all these tourists to come. They have the buses come in. They've built a lot of hotels in town. As far as the community feel, we're a tourist destination. And Kennebunk's done a great job being a tourist destination. This feels like you're trying to do the opposite side of being a tourist destination by having this community feel that I feel like, when it was told in the survey that Goose Rock's Beach is a small family-owned cottages. Small family-owned cottages haven't been at Goose Rock's Beach for 20 years. It's been continually large million-dollar homes being torn down and a huger home being put up. So the other thing, there are going to be some negative impacts to short-term rentals. But there's also a lot of positive impacts, as far as you have at least 1,000 more people in town that are going to town, going on the whale watches, going to the restaurants, going to the shops, and spending a lot of money. And that keeps people employed in town. So I I wish it seems like we're just trying to make this look like a nuisance rather than a positive. I don't know if there was some way
Well,
to balance that somehow.
That's
So-
what we're looking for balance, that's what we're trying
That's
to.
what we need to figure out.
And I'm not seeing a balance in this, I'm seeing, we're trying to see what's a nuisance, and we're trying to see the negative impact, but we're not talking about any of the positive impacts. That it creates jobs in town, it creates tax revenue, and creates a lot of positive issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
We see that.
there's no doubt that that's certainly part of it. One thing too, just keep in mind, so there were two separate surveys that went out, so one was a survey that was done by the Growth Planning Committee, which was data for the update for the comprehensive plan. And so it sounds like some of those questions that, that you're bringing up, those descriptive areas, the community character questions, I think were part of the Growth Planning Committee survey. And then there was another survey that went out that was specific just on the short-term rentals.
Seems like they overlap. So.
They did, actually, yeah. Ironically, not really intentionally, but it just so happened, that there was, questions that, couple of questions in there that growth planning had on, on short-term rentals. Interestingly enough, a lot of the questions in the growth planning committee survey were pretty similar, if not the same, questions that went out in like 2002 as part of a survey. And so,
It's not a new problem.
and so part of it also was just to see, how much have opinions, changed or remained the same in town.
What was the original intent of this when it started many months ago? What drove this to start?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's one I think we've answered. We've answered numerous
At every meeting.
times. Yeah.
May I say something? Every tourist town in the world, never mind the United States, is having this discussion. If we weren't having it, we'd be peculiar at this point. It's not like we decided to do that. It's being done everywhere. Not that that necessarily means that it's
Yeah.
correct or right, but it is what it is. And every town in the country, in the world, are discussing
Yeah.
this
So
short-term
in-
rental thing and what are the positives and the negatives, if not really doing something about it. We're
So-
not really doing anything yet.
Yeah, in the beginning of 2018, so last year, the Board of Selectmen appointed an ad hoc committee, which is what this is, to look at short-term rentals and, do some research on it. Ultimately managed a survey to just gather information about short-term rentals and to come back to the selectmen with some thoughts or maybe recommendations about, some of the questions that we're still struggling with here, like, what do we have for short-term rentals? Is it a problem here in town? Should we do anything about it? Again, because I think a lot of other communities are dealing with it. I think we've just, because this concept of a shared economy is continuing to grow, and it's a lot more prevalent than it was years ago. I think that's, communities are trying to figure out how they deal with a shared economy. A shared economy? Yeah, so a shared economy is really the sharing of resources, and most of those resources being shared just across internet platforms. And so it's Airbnb, where housing stock is now a shared resource. Uber, Lyft, all those types of different resources are now considered part of that. So communities are still just trying to figure out how that fits in with the traditional economy, for all the kind of fixed locations, like how does the taxi service now compete with Uber, and things like that. So anyways, but yeah, it's a conversation that's been going on in a lot of different communities in Maine. I think what we've found is that there's kind of the broad range of how communities react to it. Each one of them at least that I've seen, is unique in and of itself. I mean, some communities don't do anything. Some communities have some level of registration. Some go the full bore in the opposite direction and place limits on the number of short-term rental licenses. I think
Owner occupied.
have to be owner occupied. Yeah, I mean, South Portland, I think, has a 10-page application process, for
I
for
thought
a
they
short.
didn't allow any.
Oh, they
No, they,
changed it.
yeah, they allow
Redid
'em.
it, and
They
now
redid it.
it's effective.
Well, now, there was an article that in Massachusetts, the state has required any short-term rentals in the state to be registered.
It's a new state law.
So,
I think New Hampshire is doing the same thing.
Yeah, yeah.
I spoke with
They
a,
get their taxes.
well, yeah,
I spoke with a representative from New Hampshire
That's exactly what it
last
is.
weekend, and he was saying, the state is trying to come up with something, and one of the things they were talking about is to have places register. And he said, nobody's registering.
Yeah.
Or very few are
But even like the home
registering.
away site that we list with, now they're taking the state tax directly out. and So now they get to hold it for 9 months.
Yeah,
And then they
I
send
don't
it to the
think the
state for
tax
the
is
summer.
such a.
Right.
But we've always had all the taxes
Yeah.
taken out. I'm surprised that the states don't say.
All registered.
Yeah, everybody can register.
Well, and that's part, I think part of the issue in Maine is that in Maine, the local communities don't get a portion of any of the lodging tax, and I think that's been a huge point of contention, where, municipalities kind of bear the brunt of dealing with the regulatory piece, of, the hospitality industry, kind of broadly.
and they keep raising our
Uh,
taxes too.
But you don't have the ability to actually collect any of the lodging tax that comes with it, so that's a whole other, that's a whole other animal, right
There are a
there.
lot of communities that we rent at that have a local tax on top of, if we go to a home away or Airbnb.
Right,
They have a local tax on top.
Not in the state of Maine.
yep,
The state legislature doesn't allow it.
Right.
Yeah.
so.
yeah.
There's a new sheriff in town now.
Well, it's been the legislature.
Well, she'll tax us up the kazoo anyway, so it doesn't matter which one
If
it
some of
is.
it comes to the town, that can't be all bad, right?
But what'll happen is, if we do wind up getting a town tax, it's just more taxes that you have to pay. It's not like, okay, of the 10% that we pay
Yeah.
now,
I'm saying if they
1%
did
will come
into
to
it, I
us.
think there is an argument for some kind of a hospitality tax to a town. I mean, it's much more the norm than it's not. For,
Tourist towns are stressed.
Oh,
right, I
yeah.
mean, because
Right.
there's a burden to be paid, extra policing, degradation of roads, on and on. There is a cost incurred in having a lot of people come here in the summertime. And the town of Kennebunkport doesn't, other than the business owners benefiting, the town of Kennebunkport has to absorb
Absorb.
that cost. So I would argue for some kind of a levy on
We've
tourists.
tried,
Yeah.
the town has tried in the past.
I know, but that's what I'm saying, but there's a new sheriff up in the big house, so. I would think that might be an
Oh,
issue
yeah.
they might take up.
Legislature doesn't
tax?
want to give up.
Sure.
doesn't wanna give
Again,
up
to
the
come back to,
Purse strings. The legislature doesn't
yeah,
want to give up
this
control.
is true, this is true.
They-
That's what it is.
Yeah.
We give them more money than any other part of the state.
Sure,
And,
sure,
and so they're
sure.
not gonna give anything back to
Well,
us.
see, I would argue that they should, but there you go.
Yep. Well, I don't know that we're gonna solve that one.
No,
but,
no,
you
no.
know.
Probably, that's.
Never.
But again, that's how,
Yeah.
I mean, how communities sidestep that piece of it is that if they have a registry requirement, if they have a licensing requirement, then they tag a fee on the,
Right.
as a licensing fee. It's not a tax, but, I mean, it accomplishes the same purpose, if communities are looking to offset some of that.
And again, I'll reiterate, if we have a licensing fee, if you have to go in for a license, how are we going to regulate that those people who are renting get a license? there's no way
Yeah.
of policing it.
Yeah, and I'll speak just kind of generally, to that piece of it, is that, I think even with the numbers, the numbers of what you have there, I mean, you would, I think any type of a licensing fee that winds up being, a moderate fee, and that isn't gonna cover the cost of, isn't gonna cover the cost of the effects of it, not whenever you consider, all of the different, all of your different departments that have some participation or, undergo some type of, effect,
But that's the
because
case
of-
for most businesses today.
That's right, yeah.
Come on,
Yeah.
we don't get, the local town doesn't get anything from the licenses or whatever is required of businesses today.
Yeah, we generally, I mean, we don't see any lodging, we don't see any of the, the liquor or food, so,
Yeah.
but, again, it's a whole other discussion.
Yep.
So going back to, the slides there, is there anything that folks, want to see changed, modified, added?
Are we as a committee supposed to recommend to the select board whether or not you want us to do something about this? Or are you gonna bring us, or are you just gonna say, okay, here's our report?
Well, so my intent was to do this presentation for the selectmen, I think on the 28th of
Right.
February, and I think what we just what we have in here is, the recommendation to do some trend monitoring and a departmental review of how we do our, how we can track our nuisances. Because I think, what I saw in the survey questions and just overall, I mean, the character question it's a tricky piece. It doesn't really have any, that doesn't have necessarily any hard data, to go with that. The nuisance piece of it, until you start tracking some of it, you don't have any, we're very early on in the process to be able to say, yep, short-term rentals have done X. So that would, I think in, a lot of opinions that we heard, I mean, that you need some kind of data to put out there before you start putting together, another, level of reg.
So do you have the data that says, X amount of homes are on Airbnb, X amount of homes are on HomeAway, X amount of homes are on another site, and then coordinating it to see if there's certain homes on all three sites or just one, so that 5 years from now, if we want to pick this up again, you can say, okay, back in 2019, there were, 248, and
I can
5
tell you,
years-
we didn't duplicate, so we didn't duplicate, if a property showed up on multiple platforms, we didn't.
But you can, yeah.
We didn't duplicate the number there, that
Okay.
200 and, whatever it was,
48.
248 there. Yeah, we didn't wind up with two listings because it was on HomeAway and VRBO. I think what we did is we just made notes, as far as like where it showed up.
Okay.
If it,
So if we do this again in 5 years, that will be our comparison?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Or, I mean, like I said,
As long as it was
if,
documented.
staff is directed to do it on an annual basis, we can pick a point in time in the year where we say, all right, we're gonna, do
Sure.
another,
Be a good time.
review
Be
of
a
it,
good- Summertime would be a good time to do that. Nobody
so.
has anything better to do. in the summer.
That's right, yeah, there's nothing going on in the summer,
Well,
so.
one of the aides. one of
Right,
the
right, yep.
Interns.
That's right.
Well, if you do get an intern,
Give it
that's,
to an intern,
he
right?
helped this
Give
year,
it to an
right?
intern.
Yep, so,
Do you know how many private roads there are in Kennebunkport, just offhand?
not off the top of my head.
I'm wondering, because private roads where the homeowners have to maintain their road, then you would think that they should be able to have a certain amount of control over the excess, say, traffic that might occur when there's a rental property on their
Yeah,
How
I'm,
share the cost on that, though, is every homeowner on there?
That's probably why they're renting their properties
For,
out.
for our road,
Well,
Yes.
we have a road association, I think most private roads do.
Right.
Or so, I would say many private roads do, that the, each homeowner, property owner, whatever, pays a certain fee per year. And if they're recorded in deeds, sometimes those associations are more restrictive. Ours doesn't happen to be, but, we also don't have anybody on our road that's currently renting to others.
certainly
Yeah,
HO.
there's a difference between like between a subdivision, that would have an HOA, but would maybe also have a road association versus a, what I'll call a private non-subdivision road that, I would say should have a road association, although there's still some out there that don't have a road association.
Probably also depends on when they were built, because the newer ones are required to by banks, the older ones. that are
Well, yeah, I mean,
existing-
the reality of it is that, if anybody, usually when a property, changes hands and there's a bank involved, if the banks find out that there's not a road association, there's usually one that shows up fairly soon afterwards. Because the banks aren't interested in loaning money to properties that don't have some kind of a road association to them.
Yeah, that's come up before.
Yeah,
But it would,
yeah,
it
it's
would,
been
I
an
mean,
issue.
that's a good point, because there would be a lot more problem degrading a road.
Degrading.
Did I just make a word up there? If you had a rental property, that was full every weekend with 5 or 6 couples renting it, and you had that much more traffic going
Oh, it
up and down the
definitely does.
road, it would adversely affect somebody that just was, someone like me, a single person living, going up and down the road, once or 2 or 3 times a week, because I don't get out much,
How
so.
about if a family moved in and they had 5 kids and they were all drivers?
Well,
Right.
Shouldn't
that-
they pay more?
Maybe, I don't know, I don't
Yeah.
live in a
So I
private
guess
road.
Just because they're renting doesn't mean they're gonna be driving more on the
Yep.
road.
I'm
Well,
saying
there are
if it
gonna
was
be
a-
people coming to look at the property, there's gonna be
Yeah, it's more
additional.
transient.
If it was one of these party
Yep.
houses that have been turned into party houses,
Do we have
where
that
they fill
problem
them up.
in Kennebunkport?
Sorry?
We
Well,
have
that's-
Yes, we
Have that
do.
problem in
We have a
Kennebunkport?
few, but
We
we
have
don't
a
have
few
many.
party houses, yeah,
Are
absolutely.
they short-term rentals or are they,
Oh, they're short-term rentals.
are there
yeah.
also some that people own? Are the short-term rentals more percentage of party houses than?
That's what we don't have any
Somebody's-
Yeah, I
statistics
know.
on.
I don't know.
That's one of the,
Yeah.
one of our recommendations, or one of the things,
Yes.
one of the things I.
Part of the,
suggest.
the issues,
Track that.
the complaints aren't, split out to say, yep, we get X, we get X amount more from, from properties that are short-term rentals versus ones that aren't,
I
so.
think that from what I have observed, when people open up their home to rent, there's a lot of care and effort that goes into opening up your home. You don't want to just let anybody in there. I'm not saying there aren't some party houses, but I think they'd be far and few in between.
That's come out really loud and clear through all the public comment,
Right.
that people do put a lot
Right.
of effort and a lot of
Exactly.
Yeah.
You
resources
just read
into
some of the
maintaining their
comments
homes.
on these sites.
Yeah,
And just a little side note, Home Away is also vacation rentals and VRBO, it's all one.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah,
one
they're
company.
Yeah.
together.
It's just different names, they
Right.
bought them all out.
yep.
So Airbnb is the only separate one.
Yep. Yeah, and I agree. I think that's one thing that was very clear is that, I think a lot of the nuisance issues, are abated to some degree, by the fact that, property owners have the ability to choose who they're going to rent to.
Absolutely.
And I think that's, I think that's proven to be a benefit to the property owner for sure, and certainly not something that,
We don't
you know,
want just anybody going in there.
right, I mean, if you could
if they're
screen
not
all
good
your
renters,
guests,
you don't have
Sheila.
I think if you're talking about a party
Sometimes I wish I
house,
could.
it doesn't matter so much to the homeowner.
Yeah.
Because they'll have somebody come in to clean up afterwards. They're not there to have to deal with the neighbors who
So you're
might
saying
have
these are people
problems.
who do not,
They're
they're
not
just
there.
out-of-state
Yes.
owners that come in.
Yeah.
I think,
Buy.
I think the opposite over at Goose Rocks is it's a lot of these big homes that people own and come up for 2 months and they have huge parties all the time.
Well, I think at Goose Rocks, it's a bit different
Yeah,
than in town,
yeah,
where you're expecting, somebody may buy their family with children, and it's a neighborhood.
But I mean, it's the homeowner having the party.
Well, and that was,
Oh,
that was, I would say, kind of an unofficial comment that we heard, was that oftentimes, you know, the noise complaints are coming more from property owners than they are from the renters.
But I just think
Again,
that
no
sometimes
data
we
to
need to
support it,
look
but
at the
that was the
different
general
areas of town
consensus.
differently.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Yes,
Goose
that's
Rocks
for
is a
sure.
lot different from, say, the village area, you know, village residential. It's just a different feel. So I don't know if that needs to be part of the recommendations or something should be mentioned about that in the recommendations, but just, that has been part of our discussion, that we've looked at different areas of the town and those different areas may need to be addressed differently, assuming we address it at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would encourage you all to be a part of the presentation to the selectmen, you know, I mean, you know, part of the tricky piece with doing a presentation is that, you know, how do you call what you know, how long do you make it? You know,
Not long.
right, I know,
5 minutes.
that's right, you know, I've learned.
Or not too long.
But so I think it would be helpful to have, you know, to have a couple of you all be there and just to add to that conversation, you know, beyond just what I've put together here. You know, to say that, yes, I mean, this is what we found, but we also know, I mean, I didn't include in here all the breakouts of all of the survey information that we looked at, you know, from each area, you know, and the fact that, yeah, I mean, the village, you know, the folks responding from the village felt differently than the folks at Goose Rocks.
So I
Yeah.
think 3 of the 7 zones, or however many they are, wanted to, you know, it was slightly more wanted to regulate than didn't, but in a couple areas, it was way more wanted to.
Right.
As opposed to Goose Rocks, where it was just flip-flopped, where,
Yeah.
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
most of the people didn't want any regulation at all. So, Goose Rocks,
Yeah, again, which, you know,
I mean, the survey,
Makes sense, 'cause
they said
everything over there
260
is
people responded from Goose Rocks, so the survey is kind of skewed to the Goose Rocks.
Well, 30% of the people that
Yes.
responded, right?
Yeah.
But breaking, the reason I wanted to look at it separately is that Goose Rocks is historically a short-term rental community. So I think that gives you a little bit better perspective if you know, look at just Goose Rocks as to, you know, number of noise complaints that happen during the summer and stuff. You know, that's the type of thing we should be kind of trying to get a handle on. I mean, do short-term rentals cost more noise complaints than?
yeah.
than-
Of course, the irony of it would be is that if you could have followed that to its logical conclusion, you know, where Goose Rocks would say, well, leave us alone, you know, and the rest of town, you know, would say, sure, give us some regs. I mean, the reality of it is that I think you've got more of the nuisance complaints that occur down at Goose Rocks, which you're not gonna regulate. But in the areas that are more traditional and I think tend to be quieter, yeah, we're gonna have a stricter noise, you know, standard here, so. I don't,
Except
I don't
none of
know
the
that-
party houses are at Goose Rocks.
yeah,
I thought most of them were there.
No, not the ones we've been talking about here.
but,
No party houses at Goose Rocks?
Not that I know
They're not short-term rentals.
of. That's-
People live there.
I would
Right.
just like to add to, I mean, party house has a bad ring to it. When I say party house, I don't necessarily mean a bunch of kids coming in and trashing a house. That's not what I refer to as a party house. I'm referring to a situation where someone buys a house or turns their own house that they already own into a situation where they go for the wedding group that comes in for the week. You know, the parents come in, the in-laws, and they host all the out-of-town people, and it's a party every night for 4 or 5 nights over the, you know, from Wednesday to Sunday morning. That's what I'm referring to as a party house, and we do have some of those in town. Do they generate more noise, trash? I don't know, but their whole raison d'etre is to just host as many people as they can cram into the house, which is perfectly legal right now. There are no
It's because we have
regulations.
a lot of pretty good wedding venues in town too, so we're
Oh,
gonna
we
get.
do, and they do a very good job of making this a destination wedding site, which it wasn't 20 years ago, right?
Right.
It is now, it's
Hmm?
smack dab
Yeah.
at the forefront of that
I think that's
piece of
creating-
business.
That sounds like it's creating a lot of that.
Absolutely.
And the trends always change. There, always change. And now that we're so computer-oriented, I mean, this could never happen if we didn't have computers.
Right.
You know, because it's so easy to just go in and put in a town.
Politics would be different as well, so computers are.
Everything would be different,
Yeah.
everything.
So, you know, it's just, this is,
Changing world.
this is the way life is going. Thank God I'm old. It's getting harder and harder. But, you know, and then in 5 years from now, it may be altogether different. We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's, so there's, I mean, if you're really, you know, if we get a nice big snowstorm and you're really bored, there's a couple of interesting reports put out by the Brookings Institute on, that talk about the shared economy. And so if you're interested in reading any of that kind of stuff, take a look at it. It does have some interesting graphs and pictures in terms of kind of economic projections on how the shared economy is going to fare based on the kind of the more traditional pieces. You know, and so in hospitality is one of those, you know, one of those components, you know, in terms of, you know, and this is kind of globally, worldwide, what they're projecting, you know, those traditional industries, how they're going to fare in terms of growth versus, you know, the shared economy portions of it, so.
But I also think the economy being as good as it is, it's allowing people more opportunities because everybody, you know, their wallets are fatter. And so they're going to take that vacation that they maybe didn't do 5 years ago. And it, you know, that kind of snowballs as well. And then who knows, maybe we'll be in another recession in 8 years and things will be different. We
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, I think, you know, when looking at this particular report, I think it reported that most every community that had, you know, so from the perspective of lodging, that generally speaking, always the, you know, the homestays were, you know, were typically 30% cheaper than the hotels were, with the exception, I think, of like out in California, you know, San Francisco and some of the bigger cities, where it was reversed, you know, that the hotels were more affordable than the homestays, but.
It's a different clientele.
It is.
Yeah,
Definitely is.
right. Well, and that's been part of the conversation too, even in different towns here in Maine, how you, to some degree, I think you have to look at the clientele, you know, so, you know, you have to look at the vacation demographic that comes to Kennebunkport versus the demographic that shows up at Old Orchard or in South Portland or Camden, you know, it's all a little bit different. So.
The second home ownership at Goose Rocks has changed too. There aren't any, quite frankly, there aren't any teachers and carpenters and people like that buying houses at Goose Rocks Beach.
Well,
Not anymore.
and just I think from the economic perspective, and I think this follows true with what you're observing down there, is that the values have increased so much that you're now into a demographic that is just not interested in renting and doesn't have the financial need to rent, and so. You know, so you've surpassed the demographic that could afford a beachfront property, but, you know, needed some supplemental income to make it work. You know, whether it was a family group or whether it was, you know.
We'll take our vacation in June and rent it in July and August.
That's right, yeah. But
Yeah.
just the increasing values have started to price out that demographic. And now you have folks that just, you know, that don't need to rent or don't want to rent, so. But yeah, and I think that's what you're seeing, yeah.
Of course, those increased values down at the beach have kept our taxes fairly low too, so.
You do still have a $1 mill rate, so that is a significant,
Do not
that's a
complain
significant
about Kennebunkport tax rate.
reason for that. Yeah.
I've always said, the departments and the selectmen have always done a great job at keeping the budget as best as they can.
But part of that too, and I try to tell people this from other towns, part of that is because our property assessments are so high.
Hmm.
And if say, just take your home and put it into Arundel, what's the value of that house? Do you see? So you can have a house in Arundel and its value is $200,000. And your house on Goose Rocks Beach, if that's where you are, is $800,000. So they're gonna get, their taxes are gonna be much higher because they need that money for their town.
Right.
Your taxes are gonna be lower because you're being taxed on 800,000 where, the town needs X amount of dollars.
Right.
And so when you have high values, we're lucky we can keep our taxes low.
The rate can stay low.
Right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, the port is unique in the sense that it has a large amount of developed waterfront,
Yep.
that is
Yep.
valuable. But, from an operations perspective, still operates like a small town.
Correct,
Uh,
correct.
And so at some point, I think that starts to change. But for right now, that's still the case, and that's how you wind
Wow.
up with a single dollar, with a single dollar mill rate, so.
And I could get into that too.
Yeah, but, so the next step is February 28th is the intended, presentation with the Board of Selectmen. Again, I would, for those of you who can attend, I would welcome you to be there and kind of share your thoughts and opinions beyond what's on the presentation, so.
And the
Is
meeting
it-
is at 6.
The meeting's at 6, yep,
Here.
Here.
correct, yep.
So
I'll make
as it
sure-
stands right now, you're going to present to the board
Basically, the thing he did last
That's
time.
right,
Yeah.
yes,
with
that's
some
correct.
changes.
This
some
here, yep,
Small changes, the ones you're
yes,
handing out tonight.
that's right, yep.
Got it.
And you,
And my
you're
laptop
not
will
gonna
work.
recommend any
Yeah.
regulation
Yeah.
at this point? And we'll look at it at a later date?
Yeah, I mean, the two things that I have at the end there is just, I'm suggesting doing some trend monitoring, trend monitoring and looking
think
at,
that's a good idea.
and looking at the, how we deal with the nuisances, the nuisance calls and complaints, and, but again, that's more at a departmental level of saying, all right, how do we tie, is there a way to better tie, the complaints that do come in to be able to, is there, again, can we get an export from what the police gets so that then we can then tie it based on address? I mean,
They could do that with Rears remotely or something.
well, we've got a whole slew of technical hurdles that we have to address before, it all sounds great and easy, but, first it helps if everyone has the same address, I mean,
Concept.
Just
so.
out of curiosity, do you happen to know off the top of your head how many noise complaints there were that the police responded to in 2018?
No. No, I don't know
But it
that
was
off the top of my
negligible,
head.
it was.
It was not
very
it was,
few.
it was not a substantial,
And unfortunately,
Number.
the way they gave it, or those statistics we saw, it wasn't zone by zone or anything, it was
No.
just town-wide. So
Yeah.
that's what we're
Right.
saying, there has to be
Right,
a
right,
change in the way
right.
we're looking at things.
And they have to
so
be
Yeah.
willing to
that's right.
interview the
A
person.
big part of it.
Right, the police have to be involved in keeping
Right.
track of this too,
Yeah.
which right now they're
Wanna make
not.
their
That's
job
a big
harder.
change for
Yeah,
them.
really.
yeah, and so, yeah, there's a fair amount of disconnect between how things are tracked. And again, part of this also goes back to, we still operate very much like a small town.
Yeah.
In that sense, a lot of larger communities have centralized databases where, where that information can easily be joined, together.
Or accessed.
And accessed, and we just don't have that, so.
Trying to keep that mill rate down.
How does that percentage
like
of
it.
short-term rentals, that 8.5% compared to other tourist towns? Is there any?
So the one, the one that we had in previously, I looked at Portland, because that was, because Portland is one of those communities that has, I think gone the full gamut in terms of regulating short-term rentals. And what was it? It was a little over 2% of their housing stock was, was affected by it.
It's a whole different community.
It is,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
But it was,
That, and the fact that may not be all of
Right.
the
Right.
places that are rented.
right.
Right. We may not know
There's
all
a
the
big
places that are rented
unknown.
either.
That's
I
right,
don't think
yeah.
we do.
No.
There's a big unknown.
But I found that rather surprising, that, that they went as kind of hard on the regulatory role that they did
For
for
2%?
2% of the housing stock. I mean, that seemed a bit heavy-handed for what it was. And I think similarly with, with South Portland, I mean, I was surprised at the relatively small number, of properties. Again, but I think part of that is there's the ones that and then there's the ones that you don't know.
Yeah, South Portland, I think the issue was these little neighborhoods where houses are lined up right next to each other, that created a lot of issues. in
Yep.
South Portland.
Yep.
I mean, Algonquin, do they have any statistics like this in Algonquin?
So, Agunquit, has a registry of it, but, I don't know what the percentage of it, of homes are that are rentals. I would suspect that it is dramatically higher than what we have here in terms of a percentage of housing stock, so. But a lot of communities, are a little bit tight-lipped in terms of saying how many that there are, so, I put a couple of inquiries out and.
I think it's a good, positive move to see how many nuisance calls are actually short-term rentals versus other rentals. That's a nice, and this, to monitor how it
Just
goes.
private homes.
Yeah, yeah, it's,
All of a sudden, 75% of our homes are short-term rentals is a problem.
yeah, well, we do,
No consolidated school anymore.
I mean, we do trend monitoring for a lot of other things, and I mean, why wouldn't we do this, before stepping up, putting some kind of increased regs in place, but. So, yeah, so that's what I have, so,
Good
folks
job.
have anything else?
Thank you.
Thank
So-
you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, I know, I had to laugh, I looked back at the original slides and, and said, yep, we're gonna have 10 meetings on this thing, and we're gonna have a recommendation by October, so.
Right.
Thank you all for sticking it
Hanging
out. Yep,
I won't be able to be at the meeting in the end of
Okay.
February. Hopefully everybody else will be there.
Not me.
we're done, Dave.